Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Weidlich, and I'm the growth pastor here at Harvest Church. And among my duties around here are providing opportunities for helping you move from just a weekend experience, worship experience, into a way for you to find a personalized growth pathway. And we do that in a lot of different ways. One of the primary ways is by getting you into a small group, and we also provide some things to help you understand how to move to your next step. And one of those things is coming up next Saturday. It's called a Connections class, and that meets from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. It's going to be at the Heights campus as well as the Lockwood campus, and then Cody will be doing that in a couple of weeks as well. And so we invite you to that. That'll be a time for you to understand what Harvest is all about, and then the growth opportunities that are here and how you can find your best next step, what that would look like for you. So I encourage you to be a part of that. Also want to welcome Cody and Lockwood and Plentywood worshiping with us this morning. I also want to tell you about another opportunity, and that is our Harvest Bible Institute. We just are completing this coming Wednesday our second quarter, and we've been going through New Testament survey and Bible themes. And this next week in New Testament survey, we're going to be finishing off with what the Bible has to say about the future, the book of Revelation. And then starting on March the 30th, a new class is going to begin that will go through April and May. And that's going to be taught by a guy named Derry Long. And Derry is one of the pastors in Journey Church in Bozeman, our daughter church over there. Derry has been doing his doctoral studies at Birmingham University in Oxford, England, and his doctoral dissertation is about how for-profit organizations and non-profit organizations build leadership and what their best practices are and those who are successful in doing that. And so Derry is going to be doing a class on biblical leadership and taking 4 characters of the Bible and showing how they led through some unique qualities that they had. For instance, like Moses, he's going to be showing how we can lead through weakness. And then Nehemiah on goal setting, Elijah on leading through fatigue and discouragement, and Esther on something called leading up, or finding influence where you don't have it. So leading below you, around you, but also above you in your influence sphere. So I'd encourage you to take that class. It's going to be the only class we're going to be offering. We're not doing growth classes, any other Bible Institute classes. This class will be from 6:30 to 8 o'clock on Wednesday nights at the Lockwood campus. And you can sign up on the information cards or online. And I would really encourage you to do that. I think it'll be a great benefit to you. All right, you can tell that we're starting a new series today. It's called One Hell. For those of you here who that's all you can see. It's actually one hell of a day. But the theme of this series is that when Jesus came to earth, we talked last week about how one of the first things in his ministry was that he went up to the mountain of temptation, and Satan barraged him with the best attacks he could come up with. And then it says after Jesus went through those temptations that Satan left him until a more opportune time. When Jesus came to earth, all the forces of hell and of Satan came against all the forces of heaven, and they collided on earth. And on the crucifixion day, it looked like hell won. But then Sunday came, and all heaven broke loose. And that's our Resurrection Sunday and Easter Day. Now, if you've been tracking along with this, we started One Hell of a Day last week, and Vern introduced that to you, and many of you have gotten online onto onehellofaday.com and have been following those devotionals there. You can also listen to the messages there. There are places for you to do pictorial tours of the site that we're on that week. Last week, you could take a tour of the place Jesus was baptized and where he went for his temptation. There are also blogs there One blog came through this week that I'd like to read to you. It's just an example of how people are processing what we're going through in this series. He says, I think this year Lent has become alive for me. Before attending Harvest, I was a practicing Catholic, so Lent is nothing new to me, but has never taken on this kind of meaning. In previous years, it was about having to give something up, or taking something on, or no meat on Friday. It wasn't until I heard Vern's sermon last week that Lent took on a whole new meaning, and I realized that Lent is not about what I give up or what I take on, but it is about my relationship with Jesus Christ. Is Jesus a personal friend of mine, and do I go to him no matter what? How can I enhance our relationship to make it better? These are the things that have become really apparent to me over this Lenten season. And then he goes on to talk about the area of his fast and his struggles with that. As I've been thinking about what I'm fasting on, I started thinking about all the things that I should quit doing, and it became kind of about my sacrifice. And right as I got to the point of declaring what my fast was going to be, I stopped to think, well, what would it take to free up more time with God, where I could have, through this 40-day season, I could have a more, deeper and more meaningful time with God. And so what I normally do in the morning is I come in early and I make a pot of coffee, and then I go to my emails and check them out, and then with whatever time is left, I'll get into my God and I time. And so I decided that my fast for this Lent season was going to be no coffee or email in the morning before my quiet time. I would just get started on my quiet time, and then I could do coffee after that and check my emails after that. There's never any end to those. So that's been what I've done. And what I've found is, like, if I'll go to breakfast and maybe I'll have a quiet time with my breakfast, and a couple of times I've actually ordered coffee, and it's come, and I thought, oh, crap, not supposed to have coffee before that. But today I could, because it's, traditionally we're doing 40 days, and Sunday is our resurrection day. Some of you guys are filling up with Mountain Dew today because that's your fast, so you're not good for much else. But anyway, whatever your fast is, I hope that it's helping free you up for more of a time with God and more about that. All right, as we start into our series today, the theme of our time this morning is going to be the upper room and the Last Supper. Traditionally, the first part of Lent is that time when Jesus met with his disciples and in a way prepared them for the couple of days that were ahead of them. A few hellacious days for these guys. They didn't know it, but Jesus did, and so he was going to prepare them. In fact, I've been thinking about how, I don't know what's ahead in my life, but God does, and God's preparing me for that, and that's part of my trust in him. His sovereignty is that God's getting me ready for what's ahead, what's next. I'd like to start off as we get into this with something that I'd like you to take kind of a relationship inventory. Think of your friends and think of them in categories. I'd like you to set them into categories. And what percentage of your friendships would go into the category of friends who have an all-access pass into your life? Some people call them the 2 a.m. friends, the friends you could call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they would be honored that you would call them because you've got something going on, and they're part of that. These are the friends that when you get together, you dive deep. You talk about things that matter. You process things from the heart with these guys. What percentage of your friendships fall into that category? And then there's the next category, and these are kind of common interest friends. These are friends that you do things together, kind of shoulder to shoulder. You enjoy life with these people. You have common interests. And so when you get together, you go and do those common interests. You don't really dive deep with these people. That's not what that relationship is about, but it's more, these are fun people. What percentage would fit there? And then the third category would be just hi-bye friends. You know, these are friends that you know their name, you know them well enough to say hi and bye, but it's not really much deeper than that. What percentage of your relationships would be in that category? And the thing that surprised me as I looked at the Lord's Supper was that the Lord's Supper was really about restored relationships and restoring relationships. Not just our relationship with God, but our relationship with people. Now, the Last Supper began as a Passover observance, and so we need some background into the Passover in order to understand this. Passover relives the night in Jewish history when God finally convinced Pharaoh to let the Jews go. Now, God did this by killing the firstborn son in every Egyptian family. God had offered for everyone to kill a lamb and then take the blood from that lamb and spread it over their doorposts to their houses. And when the death angel came by and saw the blood on the doorposts, he would pass over that house. And the Jews did that. Evidently, from the text, some Egyptians had done that as well. But most of Egypt, their firstborn son, including the pharaohs, was killed that night. Now, there are many symbols in the Passover dinner that point us to Christ, but the primary one is that Jesus becomes our Passover lamb, whose life was given in place of ours. Now, Jesus, Vern talked about a couple of weeks ago in the extravagant giving in John 12 about that banquet that Jesus celebrated in Bethany with some friends of his. And in John 13, where we're going to begin this morning, Jesus sends Peter and John in from Bethany, which is about 2 miles southeast of Jerusalem. He sends them to Jerusalem. So this map shows you a little bit of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. When he sent them to prepare the Passover meal, they would start by going to the temple. Now, at the temple, they would buy a Passover lamb, and the law said that at dusk, they would bring the Passover lamb into the temple. They would slit its throat. Its blood would be shed. Part of that lamb would be sacrificed on the altar as a covering, as a symbol to cover their sins. And then Peter and John would take that lamb. This next slide is the temple, by the way, and they would go in where the biggest building there is in the center, and they would sacrifice that lamb there. For the Jew, it was very vivid that this lamb was taking their sin, and so it's the lamb's life instead of their life. And then with the rest of the lamb, they would take the meat, and the next slide shows where the upper room was. They would go across the city to where the upper room was. And this is in the upper city. It's in the area where the wealthier people lived. Someone that knew Jesus and evidently was deeply committed to Christ. He offered them his upper room, and that's where they went. And this is another picture of that area from a model. In front of you, you see Herod's palace. Jesus will go there in a couple of weeks in our series. You see the temple in the upper left, and then in the lower right, you see where the upper room was. This is another picture of the upper room today. If you would go and look at it, this room was actually built in the 1300s, but the interesting part of this is just the fact that they feel like this is really the site. And the reason that archaeologists feel like this is a site and about the dimensions of the upper room is because as they've dug underneath here, this area, this place used to be a synagogue. But not just a normal synagogue, because some of the writing that they found there is from the Roman era, the time of Christ. And the writing in this synagogue was Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Now let me just tell you, that wouldn't show up in a normal synagogue. There's another reason why they believe that this upper room was then where the church first met. Because when most synagogues would face toward the temple, and that would be more to the northeast. But this synagogue faced a little further north. And the reason that it faced that direction was because that was the direction where Jesus was crucified and buried and rose again. So they feel like this is the spot where the first church met, and the same spot where earlier Jesus had the Last Supper with his disciples. Now in Luke chapter 22, verse 14, Luke tells us, when the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table, and Jesus said, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. Now, as you read this next week and you think about the upper room and the Last Supper, most of us have gotten our idea of what the upper room was like by Leonardo da Vinci's picture of the upper room, right? This is what it must have looked like. And so all the disciples are sitting around this European-style banquet table, and they've all crowded to the back of the table so Leonardo could take the picture and then paint the picture. And that's probably what it looked like, right? And so the table of honor, the seat of honor would be right in the middle, and the seats of honor to the right was John the Apostle, and to the left is Judas. But I would propose to you that that's not how this thing went down. In fact, what I've got around me here is the Roman triclinium table. You hear about the triclinium table at the death of John when Herod was at Machaerus fortress, and there he was having a banquet, and his stepdaughter danced for him, and so he gave her or offered her anything she would like, and she asked for the head of John the Baptist. He was at a triclinium table similar to this. When a Jew or a Roman in that day would celebrate a feast or one of the feasts, they would do it instead of at the European-style table that you've pictured before, they would do it around a triclinium table. Now, most of us would think then at a triclinium then that the seat of honor would be right here, and it wasn't. The seat of honor would have been right over here. And they didn't sit at the triclinium. In fact, when Jesus came with his disciples, the host of the banquet would then assign the seating. And then they would lay down at the triclinium, and they would have pillows around, and the host would be here, and he would lead the dinner from here. The seats of honor would be next to him. John would be on his right side, from what the Gospels say, and then Judas would be on his left side. These were the seats of honor. And the text tells us that from the conversation going back and forth, when Jesus said, one of you will betray me, Peter motioned to John, ask him, who? And the text indicates that Peter was sitting over across from John, and John would be seated at Jesus' right, would lean over in Jesus' breast and ask him, who, Lord, is going to betray you? So the host would run the meal from here. Now, it's interesting to me that this Passover meal, if Peter and John would prepare by going to the temple, and they would sacrifice the lamb at dusk, and then they would come and they would prepare the meat from that lamb for the dinner. That dinner would start probably around 7 o'clock, but it wouldn't finish. It would go 4 to 5 hours. So when we think of the Last Supper, it wasn't just the bread and the cup. There was a whole feast that went along with that. Now, for them to be reclining at table would be helpful because they're going to be there for a little while. And all the teaching that goes on from John 13 through John 17 is a little bit of what happens during those 4, maybe even 4.5, 5 hours. So a lot is happening during this time. We get little glimpses of some of the things that we're going to learn from in our time. Now, during this meal, the theme that comes up right at the beginning of the meal, in all 4 gospel accounts, the first theme Jesus addresses is the failure of friends. For that, we're going to go to John's Gospel's account in John 13, verse 1, he says there, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and to return to his Father. He had loved the disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. All right, a little context here. We know from John 12, we talked about this a couple of weeks in extravagant giving. We know that Jesus was in Bethany, and that at that banquet in Bethany, the same kind of banquet, at the same kind of triclinium table, it was at that table that the woman came to anoint Jesus with a very expensive perfume. And she anointed his feet. And if you understand that they were reclining at table, you understand a little bit better why she anointed his feet. And you also understand that when they came to the table, that they didn't wear any shoes. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But when the woman came and anointed Jesus' feet with that expensive perfume worth at least 1 year's salary, $35,000 to $50,000 worth of a perfume to anoint him, we hear in Luke's gospel that the disciples complained at the extravagance. But John's gospel tells us that it was Judas leading the complaint, and he was saying, Jesus, why do you let her use her money like that? That perfume could have been sold and the proceeds given to the poor. Well, then John adds a little detail. In John 12, verse 6, it says, not that he or Judas cared for the poor, he was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. So now you understand a little bit of the motive behind his complaint. He wanted some of that money for himself. And when Jesus rebuked Judas and said, Judas, the poor you'll always have with me, but not me. She is preparing me for my death, and her deed will be spoken of throughout time. Well, Judas had had enough. That was it. Because the text then tells us that after that banquet, Judas went to the religious leaders and arranged for a time when he would lead their soldiers to that private place that only Jesus and his disciples knew about, where they could arrest Jesus apart from the crowds and there wouldn't be a riot. Now return to the upper room. Now they're in the upper room after the banquet in Bethany, after Judas had arranged for Jesus' betrayal that night. Now they were all seated at the table. Jesus knows what Judas has done. You'll see that in the text. And yet, how does Jesus handle a friend and his betrayal? The first thing Jesus does is say, Judas, come up here. Come sit by me at the seat of honor. What else does he do? Notice in John 13:3, Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything and that he had come from God and would return to God. In fact, that very next day he would die. This is God himself. He knew what was going on. He knew his time had come. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Jesus would come over here. He would take water, pour it into a basin, and then notice what he does. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? And Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. What's going on here? Foot washing was part of the culture. The reason is because they would walk around in sandals, and many of the streets were dirt streets, but also because of the Roman times, some of them were paved, and as you would go into the city, the streets served a secondary purpose. They would also have a drain going down as an open sewage. Now, that didn't all stay in the drain, and so as people would go through the streets, their feet got very dirty. Now, when they came into a banquet like this, it was impolite for them to wear their sandals at the dinner. So they would take their sandals off at the door in Near Eastern culture, and then they would come and they would recline at table. So it would be very polite then for them to have their feet washed. If there was a servant serving the meal, that was their role, and the triclinium table is set up so a servant could come and serve the meal from there. But evidently there wasn't a servant at this meal. So the duty then would go to the one who was given the lowest position, or who was in the lowest position of the group. Now the text indicates from the conversations and from the progression of Jesus washing their feet, and lastly he comes to Simon Peter. That would indicate that Simon Peter would be sitting, reclining here, the seat of the lowest position, which is a little bit surprising because in Matthew 18, evidently Jesus gave Peter possibly the seat of the rabbi after he left. Peter would take his position in many ways, and so Peter was kind of head of the group, even from the beginning. And yet Jesus gave him the seat of the lowest position. Sending even Peter and John to prepare the Passover, that was the job of a servant, the lowest position. So when Jesus came to Simon Peter and was going to wash his feet, a couple of things were going on in Peter's mind. One is, okay, you got me. This is my job. But a second thing was, Peter had an agenda for Jesus, and it didn't include serving. It included him becoming master, leader, conqueror. So now there's a conversation that goes on with Jesus with the group. It says in John 13:12, after washing their feet, Jesus, who had stripped down to basically the garments of a servant, Jesus now puts his robe back on, sat down and asked, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, the place of highest position. And you were right because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Now Peter is startled. Judas is disgusted. And so now John moves us into the next discussion of the night. In fact, all four Gospels include the same thing. In verse 21, now Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Now that's when Peter motions over to John. John, ask him, who? Because now Peter, remember, he's been rebuked several times over the course of the last year. And Peter's not very confident, but at the same time, he's got a lot of bravado going on, and so he's asking. And now Jesus answers, and short of him standing up and saying, right here, Judas, he's the guy, Jesus, with some class and decorum and grace toward Judas, says, it is the one to whom I give bread, or to whom I give the bread, I dip in the bowl. And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus told him, hurry and do what you were going to do. This first restored relationship, or attempted restored relationship, is with Judas, the friendly enemy. Judas had been with Jesus for 3 years. He had experienced his teaching, his miracles, his feeding the crowds, his resurrection of Lazarus. All of it. He expected Jesus to become king, but instead Jesus allowed people to throw money away in extravagant worship. He told them to become servants, and Judas wanted no part of it. And Jesus loved Judas, but Judas stabbed him in the back. What did Jesus do? How do you handle friends like that? Have you had relationships like that? People you've given your life to. you've opened up yourself to. They've been in this category, all access, backstage pass. You've gone in deep with them. You've given them everything, and they turn on you. Maybe it's a close friend from a long time, and you thought you knew them. Maybe it was someone at work who, when the competition came for another position, that they began to turn on you, to talk about you behind your back and tell lies about you. Maybe it's a spouse, someone who's been closer than anyone. And the person that they've become, you don't even recognize. How did Jesus handle that? Well, all the kindness and love in the world wouldn't change Judas. He still betrayed Jesus. And there comes a point where there's nothing you can do about this friend's choice to betray you, and you have to let them go. And so what did Jesus do? He assured him of his love, but then he sent him out. He let him go. Assure them of your love and let them go. That's how Jesus handled his friendly enemy. There's a second character that disappoints Jesus, a close friend, Peter. While Judas turned on Jesus and tried to destroy him, Peter genuinely loved Jesus. In fact, Peter had great plans for Jesus. Jesus, in Peter's mind, was lucky to have him on his team. I mean, he had no idea how much he needed Jesus. John 13:3, as soon as Judas left the room, Jesus said, "Dear children, do you notice even the shift in the way that Jesus addresses his disciples now that Judas is gone? Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you cannot come where I'm going." And Simon Peter asked, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus replied, "You can't go with me now, but you will follow me later." "But why can't I come now, Lord?" he asked. "I'm ready to die for you." And Jesus answered, "Die for me? I tell you the truth, Peter. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." In Peter, Jesus had a controlling friend. In Judas, it was a friendly enemy. In Peter, it was a controlling friend. Jesus addressed his controlling friend with the truth of Peter's arrogance. Peter wanted to make Jesus into the Messiah he wanted him to be. And Jesus had to stand up to Peter, love him, but not give in to his manipulation. And that's what Jesus did with this controlling friend. Patient with him, but he had to give him the firm truth. He had to be firm with him. Have you ever had friends like that? I have. I've had friends who, they loved me and had an incredible plan for my life. And they saw how I fit into their plans. And they were going to be able to do something with me. And they saw that they could manipulate me. They saw many times they could manipulate the organization through me. And so they wanted to get in on that. And I had to come to that point in these kinds of friendships where I loved them, but had to be very firm with them with the truth. And, you know, the surprising thing is that there are some, and I've got these pictures going through my mind even now, some of these friends who surprised me. I thought when I got firm with them, frustrated and firm, that they were going to walk away. And they got mad or frustrated, but they grew. And we're still friends today. The Lord's Supper begins with a message to relationships. Jesus is about to resolve the greatest divide in relationships between God and man, but it will also divide and restore relationships between people. And one of the things that caused Jesus' greatest distress in this life was the betrayal of friends. Can you imagine? Among his closest. You expect betrayal from your enemies, right? But from your friend? And yet the cross was meant to restore that. And if the cross forgives my betrayal of Christ, then it ought to cause me to forgive others' betrayal of me. The Lord's Supper begins with reconciling relationships. In your survey of your relationships, how do they handle conflict? How do you handle conflict? Do you reflect God's patience, His firmness, the pursuit? Or when conflict comes up, do you just kind of like go, yeah, see ya? The second theme of this Lord's Supper is the cost of reconciliation. The cost of reconciliation. He says, we're going to go into Luke's account of the Last Supper for this. In Luke 22, verse 14, when the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Jesus took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. And then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Jesus, it says, took some bread, and this was unleavened bread. He took the bread. It would be something like this. In fact, in the Passover, the significance of this bread was that it was unleavened because when Israel finally had to leave Egypt, because Pharaoh said, just go before I change my mind. And so they had to gather all of their things and gather their food, and so their bread didn't even have time to rise. When God when God redeemed them and sent them out, it was quick and it was powerful, and they had to go. And so the Passover bread would symbolize that. But now, Jesus uses the bread here to remind us of the sacrifice of his life. Like the lamb that was killed on their behalf, just as they ate the lamb after the sacrifice, Jesus had them take from his body, which was symbolized in this bread. And Jesus begins with this bread, meaning his broken body. He broke it in pieces. And he said, "This is my body, broken for you." Jesus' gift for you was given willingly. He broke it. He gave himself to pay your debt. The lamb didn't have a choice, the Passover lamb, but Jesus did. And Jesus takes on the picture of a lamb all the way from Isaiah 53. He takes that picture of the lamb because do you know that when a lamb is attacked, it won't run, neither will it defend itself. It will just lay down and accept death. Just as Jesus gave his body and accepted death on my behalf. Now, in this broken body, there are two messages. One is that Jesus gave his body, he broke his body in my place. But there's a second symbol that comes from this broken bread. And that is, as Jesus took this bread, and this, by the way, you might jot down 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, because Paul picks up this theme that's indicated in this story. Paul picks it up because Jesus took the bread and he broke it, and he gave each disciple some of that bread to eat. And Paul says, when we take from the bread, are we not all taking from one loaf, so that we who are many become one? And his idea is, when you come together, he says to the Corinthians, you actually do more harm than good, because when you come together, there's division among you. There's a class distinction. The rich from the poor, the slave from the free, the Jew and the Gentile. But he says, when we come to the Lord's table, we come from one bread. And so the person who eats from that bread in an unworthy manner, in other words, with unresolved conflict, when you're allowing division among you, you eat and drink judgment to yourself. I don't know about you, but when I grew up around the Lord's Supper and communion, I was told before I took communion, now confess all your sins or you eat and drink judgment to yourself. That's not what he's saying. You see, my sins were taken care of by Christ on the cross. He's saying, if you have unresolved conflict, or if there is division in the body, don't take the Lord's Supper, indicating oneness through Christ. If you do, you eat and drink judgment to yourself. The Lord's Supper is all about reconciling relationships. There's a second message. In Luke 22:20, after supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." The cup of the covenant in the Passover, actually the rabbis took that cup and made it into 4 cups. There's a promise in Exodus 6 that God says to Israel that he would do 4 things for them. And so the rabbis made 1 cup of wine into 4 toasts of God to Israel. The first thing he says in Exodus 6 is that I will set Israel apart as my people. This is the cup of sanctification, that Israel was set apart as God's people. And so he would pass the cup around, and they would all drink to that. And then they would take the second cup of wine. And in Exodus it says, I will free you from slavery. They would go into the Passover as slaves, and they would leave it as free under God. And so this was their freedom from slavery, and they would drink that cup. And then the host would take a third cup during the meal. And that third cup, God promises them in Exodus 6, I will redeem you with power. This is sometimes called the cup of the plagues, because the power that God demonstrated to free Israel was all the plagues that freed them, and finally that plague of killing the oldest son, God's power of redemption. And they would drink that cup. And then there was a fourth cup based on the fourth promise, where that God said, and I will be your God. We serve the one true God. And so they would drink that cup. But Luke makes a distinction. Luke says, after the supper, he took another cup of wine. At the beginning of the Passover meal, the host would take a cup and he would fill it with wine. And then he would place that cup down, and it would stay there throughout the whole Passover Seder. No one would touch it. That cup was called Elijah's cup. That cup came because the rabbis said from Malachi 4, the last verse of the Old Testament, look, I am sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arises. Before Messiah comes, Elijah would come to announce his coming. When John the Baptist came, they asked Jesus, is John the Baptist Elijah? Is that the one prophesied who would introduce Messiah? And Jesus said he is. So at the Passover, after the dinner, Jesus evidently, I think, took Elijah's cup and he drank from it. Now that got the disciples' attention. That just never happened. But by drinking it, Jesus said, I am the fulfillment of the promise. Elijah came announcing me, I am the promised Messiah. And then Jesus infuses this cup with new meaning. He took the cup of wine and said, this is the cup of the covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. Every Jew would know what he was talking about, because Israel was born out of a covenant that God cut with them. Back in Genesis 15, God said to Abraham, Abraham, I am going to give you a son, and you are going to become a great nation, and I will give that nation the land that you're standing on now, today's modern Israel. And Abraham says, that's a great idea. I love that idea. Here's the thing. I'm in my 90s, okay? I don't have any kids. And God said, and Abraham said, so how do I know this promise is going to happen? And God said, I'm going to cut a covenant with you. And he used terms that Abraham would be familiar with, because when kings made a treaty, they would get 4 animals. They would kill the animals and cut them in half. This is going to be graphic. There would be a path, like a ditch down the middle. They would put a side of that animal on each side of that ditch, all 4 of them, and the blood would run down that ditch. Each king making the treaty would then walk down that blood path, and as if to say, if I break the terms of this covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. Jesus said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement, a new covenant, confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. Abraham couldn't keep the covenant. Israel didn't keep the covenant. You and I can't keep the covenant. It's a covenant with his blood. We don't walk through that blood path. Jesus provided the covenant. And he offers it to you, just as he offered it to Judas, but he rejected it. He offered it again to Peter, and he would accept it. And there's your question. Have you accepted his covenant toward you? You see, Lent is not about you doing something that's going to earn God's favor. It's not about you giving up something to earn God's favor, because God's favor has been earned by the death of his Son. Justice had to be paid, and it was paid in Christ. This is the cup of the new covenant, Jesus said, sealed with my blood. And so as we come to the Lord's table, what we're saying as we come is, I've accepted God's covenant delivered by his blood to forgive my sin and to restore my relationship with him. And we do it every time we do it to give thanks to him for what he's done for us. And so my question to you is this. It's twofold. Have you ever accepted God's gift offered to you? He doesn't force it. He just offers it and says, I can forgive your guilt and restore my relationship with you. Now, if you've accepted that, I'd ask you this side. Is that being reflected in your relationships with others? Are you offering them that same kind of relational restoration because of what Christ did for you? Are you reflecting that in your relationships with other people? Let's pray. I want to give you a moment to think about that and just ask God to speak to you about those 2 questions. Your heads bowed and eyes closed. This is an audience between you and God alone. If you're here this morning and you've never officially, at a point in time, said, God, yeah, that's me. I've lived my life without you. Maybe I've even tried to insert you by earning your favor without realizing the cost that you paid to earn God's favor and restore me in a relationship with you, with God. If you'd like to do that this morning, let me guide you in a prayer. It's just between you and the Lord. Start with something like this. Just tell him about, God, I've tried to live my life without you. I've disobeyed your covenant. I could never fulfill it on my own. Just admit that to him now. And then Christ died on the cross to take your guilt, to provide the blood sacrifice in your place, to become your Passover lamb. And just tell him now, God, I accept your offer to forgive me because of your death in my place, taking my guilt on yourself. And I accept that. Tell him that now. then the difference between Judas and Peter's betrayal is that Judas never did turn back to God and ask for forgiveness or follow God. Peter did. And so right now, would you tell Jesus, God, I admitted my failures and now I'm coming back to you and I'm going to follow you with my life. Just tell him that now. Now, with your heads bowed and eyes closed, this is a personal moment. It's a private moment. And I'd just like to celebrate that with you. If you prayed that prayer this morning, would you just let me know and say, Tim, yeah, I prayed that prayer and I accepted God's gift on my behalf. I did that this morning. If you prayed that prayer this morning, would you just lift a hand and let's catch eyes and just say, yep, Tim, I did that this morning. You can do that now. I prayed that prayer. I accepted Christ's guilt on my behalf. Okay. Good job. Welcome to God's family. His blood, his guilt is paid on behalf of you. Anyone else? I prayed that prayer this morning. If you're a Christ follower, my prayer for you this week is that God would use you and your trust in him to begin restoring relationships or pursuing that. You can't force it, but you can certainly offer it. God, as we come to the Lord's Supper today, we want to celebrate what you've done not only to restore our relationship with you, but also to restore our relationships with others. And God, we take those relationships that are in relational crisis now or stress, and we give them to you and ask that the impossible, incredible thing that you did with us, you would do through us. And we'll celebrate that as we take the bread and the cup. In Jesus' name.